I'm a big fan of Bishop John Shelby Spong. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that name before. He's an Episcopal bishop, or was. He passed away in 2021. And he was a big, outspoken writer and speaker and thinker about religious liberalism, about thinking about religion for the modern era. How do we make it work? He spoke often about how for him it was having 3 daughters, was for him what made him realize that some of the teachings of the church needed to be updated about women and their place and their role in society when he had 3 daughters, all who had advanced degrees and positions and careers. But one of the anecdotes that he spoke about a few times that always stayed with me is about meeting Carl Sagan. And the two of them got to meet a few times. Carl Sagan, the great scientist, the popularizer of cosmology, teaching about the origins of the universe. And once when they met at a conference, Bishop Spong said that Carl Sagan looked really excited. He had something important to tell him. And what he said to him was, "Did you know that if Jesus literally left the earth when he rose up to heaven at the speed of light 2,000 years ago, right, as the traditional doctrine goes, he wouldn't even be out of our solar system, let alone our universe right now?" And what that goes to is the question of many people, when they think about where heaven is, where God lives, at least when we're young children, we're taught to look up, right? Up there somewhere. There's this traditional cosmology in the religions that we're down here on earth and God is somewhere up there. And Carl Sagan's point is up there must be really, really far away. Because even at the speed of light, for 2,000 years, you wouldn't reach it. You'd barely leave our solar system. Or a galaxy, maybe. Could be off there. Still a lot of other galaxies. But what's important to note there is that this is one of the issues in the modern world with religion. So many people are faced with science, with philosophy, with teachings and thinkings that don't fall in line with what they were taught as children about God, about the origins of revelation, of Torah, of commandments, of mitzvot. And it's something that we all have to struggle with at some point in our lives, of how do we reconcile the two. And the truth is that many of us were taught about a very traditional idea of God. A God that really stems from Greek philosophy, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. A God that's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. A God that looks down and watches each of God's creatures, each person, and chooses what's going to happen to us, has a very important and integral role in our lives. Now, if that's the God you believe in, I don't want to change your minds. That's not the goal of my sermon today. But for many, a belief in a God like that is difficult. They look around at the world and they see bad things happen to good people. As Jews, we know all too well that's true. And if God knows about bad things, if God has the power to stop bad things, and if God is all loving, all good, why is it that bad things exist? And people who confront that question are forced to address, maybe God doesn't have the power and the ability to change things. Maybe God knows about our suffering and our pain. Maybe God loves us and wants good things to happen to us, but God doesn't have the ability to step in and intervene. But if God can't change things in our lives, they ask, why pray to God? Why worship that God? Or for some, God might have the power to intervene and to do good. God might want to do good, but they take away the omniscient, that God isn't all-knowing. God doesn't know that I'm suffering. And again, if God has the ability to impact our lives, God wants to impact our lives, loves us and cares about us, but doesn't have the knowledge to do so, again, the question comes up, what kind of God is that? And for those who take out the third part, that's perhaps the most difficult to deal with. A God that knows when we suffer, a God who has the ability and power to stop suffering, to choose what happens to us, but isn't really omnibenevolent, isn't really loving, isn't really good. Right? That God's less of a God and more of a monster. a God that chooses our suffering and perhaps even enjoys it. You don't get many rabbis and theologians who take out that one, but it's a choice. But we get stuck in this problem, the theodicy as it's traditionally addressed in philosophy, the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? And what that really is, as I said before, is this Greek philosophy, this idea that's implanted on Judaism. One of my teachers, Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson, who himself considers himself a process theologian, which is beyond the pale of this sermon, or on the scope of it, but it's another way of thinking about God, process theology. He has this beautiful analogy of when you have a house, and there's a really ugly wallpaper on it. And finally, when you go to change that wallpaper and you peel it back, and it turns out that what's beneath that wallpaper is actually a beautiful coat of paint, or maybe beautiful wood paneling. Whatever is beneath it is actually more special, more beautiful, better than whatever it was covered up with. And he tells us that that's actually what Greek philosophy has done to the conception of God. They've put these ideas that later Jewish philosophers in the medieval era talked about God in these terms of all-knowing, all-loving, and all-good, all-powerful. But that the Torah doesn't describe God as any of these things. In fact, in the Torah, we see God sometimes making mistakes. In the Torah, we see God struggling sometimes, fighting with the other forces. God struggles, overcomes them, but struggles with tohu vavohu in the book of Bereshit. God struggles with the chaos that existed in the world before creation. So the God of our tradition, he says, doesn't need those qualities, and it's a false struggle. It's a false issue we face in the modern era, trying to deal with that problem of evil. And the reason I wanted to talk about this all to you today is because today we get the 10 Commandments. And what's the very first commandment? I am the Lord your God. Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I am the Lord your God. That's the very first commandment. It's the bedrock of the mitzvot, the foundation for Jewish practice and identity and observance and ritual and community and connection, all of these things. If it's not just a social club, the foundation of it is built on this idea of God. What I want to tell you this morning is that there are many different concepts of God. I'm not going to ask anyone to raise their hand if they believe in God, if they don't believe in God, what kind of God you believe in. But it's a question I think each and every Jew must ask themselves. I often talk to high school or university students or young adults who tell me, Rabbi, I'm actually an atheist. They often seem uncomfortable to tell me that they're an atheist, that they don't believe in God. The truth is, sometimes I meet with older congregants, people in the hospital, people during an illness, sometimes people even in palliative care who tell me, Rabbi, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. And the answer I often tell people when I ask them to tell me a bit about the God that they don't believe in is that I don't believe in that God either. Because too often people were taught God is an old man in the sky with a beard looking down, reaching down, changing things in our lives. And that's not the God that I believe in either. So if that's the only way of defining and understanding God, then I would be an atheist too. Now, I don't think I'm an atheist. I'm very much a theist. I very much believe in God. But our tradition offers us many different conceptions beyond that one image. And in fact, as Rabbi Artson tells us, that image of God is the ugly wallpaper on top of the rich tradition that is Jewish theology, that is our Jewish teachings about God. The Rambam was a rationalist, the great medieval philosopher. But one of the things he reminds us in his theology again and again is that God is infinite and we are finite. We are just human. And that inherently any word, any description we have of God, any understanding we have of God is going to be flawed, is not going to be enough, is going to leave something out, is going to be limited. And so he tells us we can try to think about God, but to even begin that endeavor, we should recognize that we can only understand parts of God. We'll never understand the whole picture. My teacher, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, would teach that God isn't someone we understand through logic and philosophy, even though he was a philosopher. But in this sense, he's an existentialist. We relate to God through our understanding and our own engagement with God. The same way we know other people, not by learning about their biography, we know them from being in relationship with them, from talking to them, from knowing them, being a part of their lives each and every day. He tells us that in those moments when we engage in religious experience, we learn about God, the same way we learn about the people in our lives when we interact with them. Or mystics like Arthur Green, who comes from a more Kabbalistic tradition and tells us that God is encountered in revelation, in creation, in the world around us. When we go out into the world, everything we experience in some way is God. Much like Baruch Spinoza or other pantheists who teach that the universe, that nature, these terms are interchangeable with God. God isn't some being outside of the universe who interacts on it, deciding what's going to happen. God is the universe. God is the things that go on in the world. Martin Buber, who taught that God is in our relationships with other people and with the world around us. When we encounter someone as an I and a thou, rather than an I and an it. When we see people and the world not as objects for us to benefit from, but wholly on their own terms. In those moments, we encounter God. I'm currently teaching a class in the philosophy of Rabbi Louis Jacobs. Meets online Wednesday nights. If you're interested, there's a few sessions left. You can still join. Lots of fun. But Rabbi Louis Jacobs was a British rabbi who was part of the Orthodox community until eventually he was accused of heresy, of being beyond the pale for his teachings. Teachings that today, if you come to the class, you'll learn most of us understand and accept and believe in, and even in Orthodoxy are relatively accepted. But he really tried to bridge the gap between modernity and tradition. He didn't agree with the religious naturalism of thinkers like Kaplan and Spinoza, where God is reduced to just the universe. Because how do you talk to the universe? How do you relate to the universe? To those thinkers who insisted you needed to believe in a personal God. A God like that old man in the sky. A God that doesn't fit in with our understanding of the modern world, of how science and how the world works, how the universe is. But instead he taught that we can understand God as the power in the universe that makes for righteousness. If belief in God means that by faith we affirm that the universe is so constituted that goodness will win out, then God, far from being dead, is truly alive. God is the power that allows us to be good. God is the order. Or as one of my teachers would say, God isn't the cancer, but the doctors and the nurses who care for our loved ones. God isn't the fire, but the firemen who run into a building to save people. That's where God is found in our world. I don't want to change anyone's idea of God. If you believe in the traditional idea we began with, I'm not saying that you shouldn't believe in that. But if you believe in something else, I'm saying it's okay. And I'm saying you're in good company. That very first commandment, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am the Lord your God. And we stood here shortly when we heard those words as our ancestors stood at Mount Sinai. But the tradition teaches they heard those words directly from God. But as you listen and read in our Torah, the people couldn't bear to hear it from God's voice directly. And there are different traditions of, did God speak the whole 10 Commandments? Or maybe God only spoke the first couple. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. Or maybe God just spoke that very first line. Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I am the Lord your God. And that's the only line that the Israelites heard from God's self. There's this Hasidic teaching, though, that actually it wasn't even the first sentence or the first word, Anochi, that they heard directly from God. Just the very first letter, Aleph. What sound does an Aleph make? It's a silent letter. to empty breath. And what the teaching is here to tell us is that each person heard and understood God in their own way. Each of the Israelites were able to interpret and understand that sound. And there wasn't one statement, one clear understanding, one clear idea. And that whatever our conception of God is, there is room in our tradition for it. Too often today we find this teaching or that teaching and we say this has to be the right way. You have to believe this or you're out of the group. You're beyond the pale. But according to this teaching, no one can claim to know God any more than anyone else. We all heard that first aleph, that first breath, that first commandment in our own way. And that's the essence then of God and our tradition, is for each of us to struggle, each of us to listen for that word, that aleph, that letter, and each of us to hear God's voice in our life, however we hear it. But I encourage you to think about that question. Because again, it's the foundation for everything we do. If we don't know what we think about God, who is it that we're praying to? Why is it that we're observing the mitzvot and the commandments? Why is it that this text that we read here in this table next to me, the Torah, is meaningful? If it's God's words, but we don't know what we mean by God, there's something missing from our tradition and our practice. This Shabbat, I hope that each of us can take that moment to think about God, to hear God's voice in our lives, and that together, that'll strengthen not only our own practice as individuals, but our practice as a community. Shabbat Shalom.